Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rochelle from Rochelle.Handmade.Designs, and in this video we are doing a sew along. Finally! We are doing a sew along for this puff sleeve top utilizing New Look 6704. So before we get started, go ahead and hit the like button and the subscribe button, and also turn on the notification bell so you are notified every time I upload a new video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get over to the sewing table and let's go ahead and get this sew along right on. All right, so this is a sew along for this top, which is kind of like a puff sleeve. You could kind of say this is a puff sleeve, but it's not really a puff sleeve to me. I think the description online says that it is a puff sleeve top, so we're just gonna roll with it. But this is New Look 6704. I will be sew along to view A on this pattern. So first, go ahead and pull out your instructions. So I'm going to start with the instructions, and then we're going to move over to the supplies that you need in order to construct the top. So pull out your instructions, and like I said, we will be sewing along to view A, the top. So the pattern pieces you will need is pattern piece 1 through 7. So you need your front facing, your loop, your back, your collar, your sleeves, and your cuff. Now I want to make note of pattern piece number 4, which is the back. You need to cut that with the wrong side of your pattern piece down on your fabric, okay? Now, also, if you look at the sewing directions, if you are new to sewing, you need to know what all the glossary, which is this section right here. This is your glossary. You need to know that your seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch seam allowance unless otherwise indicated. Also, you will be pressing your seams open. Now, I will be using my serger, so I will be pressing all my seams to the back portion of my garment, and I will mention that in the sew along as well. Stay stitching is done at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and also E-stitch is also done at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So just make sure that you read the glossary before you get started with anything. Also, make sure that you interface pattern piece number 2, 5, and 7 as well. Now, the last thing that I want to draw your attention to is if you are wanting to do the pants, you could follow the layout for your pants up here on B. I am using 45-inch fabric for mine, so I will follow along to the cutting layout for 1A for the top. Like I said, you could use whatever fabric you want. I will be using 45-inch fabric, so I will be following this layout. So let's go ahead and get right on into the supplies that you need in order to construct this top. All right, so here are the supplies that you need in order to construct this top. Of course, you're going to need the pattern, which is New Look 6704. You'll also need some pins. So I have some pins right here. You will need coordinating thread that matches the fabric that you are using. You will need scissors. I have one for paper, one for fabric. I never mixed the two there. You will also need your seam ripper and some clippers. I use these clippers at the sewing machine. You will also need some marking tools. I have a disappearing ink and I have some chalk so I can see it on my fabric. I also have a point turner just in case I need to poke out some sharp curves as well. The only notions that you will need is some buttons. So I may decide to change my buttons at the very end. I'm not sure yet, but these are the buttons that I chose so far for my top. But I may change out the buttons at some point, but you will need 5/8 of an inch buttons in order to construct this top. Now, I do want to mention one thing also, that when I cut fabric, I do not use scissors. I use rotary cutters. I use one for paper and one for fabric. I never mix the two there. That's why they are labeled. This one, I think the paper portion came off of it. So actually this is a new one. So that's why it's not labeled yet, but one for paper, one for fabric, never mixed the two there. And I use these when I cut paper and when I cut fabric or tissue paper and fabric. Now that's all the supplies that you need in order to construct this top. So let's go ahead and get right on into the pattern pieces. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the pattern pieces you will need in order to construct this top. So the first pattern piece that you will need is pattern piece number 1, which is your front. You need to cut 1 unfold of fabric. The next pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 2, which is the back. You need to cut 1 unfold of fabric. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 3, which is your loop. You need to cut 1 on the bias of your fabric. So make sure that your grain line or your arrows is facing evenly across, and you're going to cut on the bias. So do not forget that, otherwise your loops will be off, okay? So that's pattern piece number 3. The next pattern piece is pattern piece number 5. So pattern piece number 5 is your collar. You need to cut 2 unfolded fabric, and you're going to cut 1 of interfacing on the fold of interfacing. Next piece is pattern piece number 7, which is your cuff. You need to cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. And the last pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 6, which is your sleeve. You need to cut 2 of fabric. Now that we talked about the pattern pieces, let me go ahead and show you the adjustment. So if you look at the back of your pattern piece, you will notice that the finished garment measurements for the bust, you have size 8 is a 43, 10 is a 44, 12 is a 45.5, and so forth, right? So I know my bust measurement is a 40.5. Like I have said in almost every single video for a top, I like to have 2.5 to 3 inches of ease. So because of that, I want to make sure that my finished garment measurement falls in at 43.5 to a 44. So with that being said, I'm going to cut a size 10 based off of the finished garment measurement for view A, which is a 44. Now, also with that, I need to look back up at the waist. The waist shows a waist measurement of a 25. Well, my waist is a 32. I want to make sure that I have enough room to, 1, fit over my body, and 2, I'm not squeezing. So for the waist measurement, I can go up 2 inches to a 34, or I can go up a total of 4 inches to a 36 and give a little bit of a looser fit in the waist. So I think I want to do a 34, but I may opt to do a 36. For the hips, I want room at the hips. My hips is a 44. So I could give 2 to 3 inches of ease for the hips. Now for me, I want a finished hip measurement of a 47, which is 3 inches. I'm sorry, which is, the hip measurement is a 34.5. I want a 46.5, which is 12 inches of ease, okay? 12 inches above the hip measurement, I'm sorry. So basically what I have to do is take whatever I need to add, divide it by 4, and add that to my front and back pattern piece, which is pattern piece number 1 and 2, which is why I have that out. Now I have already done this, but I'm gonna show you once again how you make that adjustment in order to get the fit that you want, okay? So I'm gonna move my pattern piece number 4, which is my back, out of the way and show you on pattern piece number 1, which is the front, and then you'll make the same adjustment to the back of your pattern piece, okay? So just grab a piece of paper and a ruler. So make sure you grab a ruler that has make sure you grab 2 rulers. You want to grab your see-through ruler, and then you also want to grab an SA curve ruler or a hip curve ruler. So let me grab a hip curve ruler quickly, because everyone does not have a SA curve ruler. So because you do not have an SA curve ruler, let me grab the hip ruler so you're able to see that as well, okay? So I have 4 rulers here. I have my see-through ruler, I have my regular 3-inch ruler, and then I have my SA and my hip curve ruler, okay? So I'm just gonna move that out the way. Grab a piece of paper, okay, that you will need. So the first thing that you will need is your ruler, a straight ruler. You wanna mark out your bust all the way across. Mark it out, okay? The next thing, go to your waist line. Make a line all the way across, okay? Now, where it says 5/8 of an inch hem allowance, that is your hip, okay? So that's your hip. So what you want to do next is measure from your waistline to your hip to see how long that is. Now, I believe when I measured it, it came to about 7.5 inches. But depending on the size that you cut, it may be 8, it may be 6 3/4. So the pattern piece may be a little different depending on the size that you cut. Also, you want to measure from your bust to your waist in order to transfer that line to the back portion of your pattern. So I'm going to measure from my from my bust to my waist. And if you notice, I'm measuring upside down for a reason, so I could get a clear idea of how far it is from my bust line to my waistline. So putting the top portion of my ruler at my waist, from my bust to my waist looks like 5 3/4 of an inch. So you want to make note of that. So I'm gonna write that as a note on my pattern. So note, and just put bust to waist, 5 3/4 inch. So you're going to measure the same thing on your back pattern piece. You're just going to measure from your waist up that same distance that you just marked right here as a note to yourself, okay? Now, one thing I did is when I looked, and I normally do not cut a pattern size 10 ever. Okay, so this is the first time. So what I did was measure the pattern pieces. And what I mean by that about measuring the pattern pieces, I measured, because I cut a size 10, I measured the pattern piece across. So I am going to put it at the very end of number 10 and measure across. That gave me 11.5 inch. So I took the 11.5 inch right here, multiplied that by 2, which gave me 23, which means that this front piece, even though it's cut on the fold, the entire piece would be 23 inches across. Well, I need a 44 inch. So that just gives me almost half of what I need in order to have the top fit me at the bust. I went ahead and did the same thing for the back. So I measured across the bust line after making that line, and that gave me 11 3/8. I multiplied that by 2, which gave me 22 3/4, or 22.75. Well, you have seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch. Multiplied that by 2 is 1 1/4. So when I subtract it, I get a finished garment measurement of 44 inches. So that measure out to be correct. Okay, so now I want to show you how I made the adjustments on the side in order to fit me at the bust, the waist, and the hips. So the first thing I want to do is, because the bust is where I don't need to do any modifications there. Now the waist for a size 10 was a 25 inch waist. Well, I am a 32, so that's not going to fit me. So I did decide that I want to give a little bit of room. So I want a 34 or 36. Now, me personally, because I like even numbers, I'm going to do a 36. And that gives me, that means I need to add 11 inches to my waist, a total circumference of 11 inches. So I'm going to take this 11, divide it by 4, you use a calculator, divide it by 4, and that gives me 2 3/4, or 2.75. So what I'm going to do is, at the waist line, you want to measure from this line right here, whatever size you cut, you're going to measure out that distance. So for me, it was 2.75. So I'm going to measure out 2.75. So make sure you only do that at the waistline. Whatever amount that you need to add to it, take that number, whether it's 10, 11, or 12, divide it by 4. And then once you divide it by 4, it gives you that number that you're going to measure out. Okay? Go to your hem line, or your hip. Well, for my hip, I wanted a 46.5, which is 12 inches above the finished garment measurement, which means I take that 12, divide it by 4, which means I need to go out 3 inches. So at the hem line, I'm going out 3 inches, and then I make my dot. All right, so now that I have the 2 dots right here, which I already connected it, but you could see the point right here. So you connect it. So what you're gonna do is make a line. Now this is where your hip curve ruler comes into play. Now, if you could see this, you see that the curve is going this way. So what you wanna do is take that, follow the curve, right? And you're going to connect the waistline to the hemline like you see for the curve. So all you're going to do is place your hip curve line in between those 2 points and make a line, okay? So you're gonna make a line. The next thing you want to do is you see where your bust line to your waistline. You see what part of the hip curve ruler it's taken shape. So between the 2 and the 7 3/4 is where it's taken shape. So you're gonna do the same thing and follow that line from the top of your arm's eye, the bottom portion of your arm's eye, all the way to your waist measurement and make that line like I did here, okay? So now that you made the modification to the front, you're going to do the exact same thing for the back. So make sure whatever you do to the front pattern piece, you do to the back. And do not forget to transfer your notches to the end to make sure you have that connect. So just make sure you do that. So now that we talked about how to make that adjustment, let's go ahead and get into sewing. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the loop. So go ahead and grab pattern piece number 3, which is the loop where you should have cut 1. Now, before we get started on sewing this together, let me show you everything that you should have as far as all the pieces. So you have pattern piece number 3, which is cut 1. Pattern piece number 4, you needed to cut 2 with the right side of your pattern face down, okay? This is pattern piece number 4, right? Also, you need pattern piece number 1. You should have cut 1 on the fold of fabric there. And then also I wanna say the entire fold, you need to place this against the fold and cut all the way around, okay? We will slash into that when we get to that part of the instructions. Pattern piece number 2, this is pattern piece number 2 where you need to have interface pattern piece number 2. Pattern piece number 4, you need to have one of the collars interfaced as well. And then you have pattern piece number 7, where you need to interface both of pattern piece number 7, which is your cuffs. And then pattern piece number 6, okay, which is your sleeves. So now move all your pattern pieces out of the way and grab pattern number 3, and we're gonna start off with our loops, okay? So the first thing you want to do is what you're gonna do is with right sides together, you're going to fold your loops in half. Now I would give mine a press, so go over to the ironing station that you have set up in your home or wherever you're sewing at, and you're gonna sew 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. However, what I'm going to do is I'm gonna pull some thread from my sewing machine. After pressing it, I'm gonna put it in the middle and then stitch it close to where I could pull it out really, really quickly. So I'm gonna sew using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance right on the side. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that we have our loop sewn, now, like I told you, I was going to have a long tail, and that's easy for me to pull it through because when I pull it, I could pull it right side out now. So just make sure if you're using a point turner or whatever you're using, that's completely up to you. But what you want to do is go ahead and pull your loop right side out. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that my loop is turned right side out, I'm gonna go ahead and clip that off. And you want to give your loops a good press. So you're gonna do that now, but I'll do that in just a second after I cut my loops into 5 equal parts. Now, according to the instructions, it says that you want to cut your loops into 5 sections, each 2 3/4 inch long. So what you want to do is take your loop and measure 2 3/4 for each loop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure and make a mark on mine, so therefore I know where my 2 3/4 is. Now I could use my mat, but I could also use my ruler. For me, I'm going to use my ruler and do it that way. So I'm going to measure 2 3/4 and cut it into 5 sections. So go ahead and do that now. So after you cut one, you want to, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put them together because it'll make it a little easier to where each one is even. I'm going to cut a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth. So that's 2. And then this is just extra that you could just throw in the trash, okay? So you have all 5 of your loops. Now that you have your loops cut out, go ahead and grab pattern piece number 2, which is your front facing. So now mine, I have already done this portion, but I'm going to walk you through this portion. So this is the right side. And what you want to do is go to the sewing machine, and on the side and the bottom, you want to create a basting stitch for you to press in 1/4 of an inch. So on both sides and the bottom, create a basting stitch 1/4 of an inch, and then press your, press to that basting stitch line, both at the bottom and at the side. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that you have that pressed and everything, what you want to do is you're going to fold your loops in half like this, and using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to baste them, baste the raw edge 5/8 of an inch away from the press edge. Now you're going to do that for all 5 loops. So go ahead to the sewing machine and do that now. All right, so now that we have went ahead and basted our loops together, all 5 of those, by the way, you're gonna need 3, put the other 2 out of the way. That will be used for our sleeves. So go ahead and grab your front facing, and what you're going to do is you're going to place your loops with the raw edges right at that dot. Now make sure that where you basted at, you have that touching your dot. And then you're going to pin it in place. So you're just going to place it on this side where it's the inner facing. So you're not going to put it on the right side, you're going to pin it on the wrong side. Just like that. And make sure that where you stitched at, that is on the dot. So let me try to bring it up a little bit closer so you can see. So you place that portion on your dot, and then pin. I'm gonna do another one for you so you can see it. So you have the loop, you're gonna place where you stitched at the 5/8 of an inch on that dot, and then you're going to pin. Then I'm just going to take my pin and pin it in place. And do the last one the same way. Take your loop, put it on the dot, and then take a pin and pin it in place. So you should have it should look like this. Now what you're going to do is you're going to baste along those lines to baste the loops in place. Now you can turn it this way if you would like, but I'm going to baste mine just in place right here along that line. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that you have your loops basted to your front facing, what you're going to do is go ahead and grab pattern piece number 1, which is your front. So go ahead and grab pattern piece number 1. Now, if you notice on my pattern piece, what I did was mark my number 1, which signifies the back of my pattern. Reason being is because my fabric looked the same on both sides. So I want to signify what side is the back and what side is the front. So what you're going to do is open it out with the right side up facing you. So this is the right side of my top, right side up facing me. And then what I'm gonna do is with right sides together, so this is pattern piece number 2, which is your front facing, you're going to pin matching up the dots to the dot right here in the center, okay? So make sure you match those up and make sure you match up this dot right here to that dot in the center of your top. So match it up as best as you can, of course. And then you're going to pin. So I'm going to pin at that dot. And then I'm going to pin along both sides. So I have a dot right here. I want to make sure that that matches to the dot right there as well. And I'm going to pin there. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. Now I'm going to pin going upward so I'm able to get very close. So this dot right here, where you see this dot, matches to this dot right here. So you're going to make sure you pin that dot as well, okay? Now, what you want to do is you're going to base along the center front. The center front is right in the center of your top. So you're going to base that section and then you're going to sew along the lines that you've seen, which is right here. You're going to sew along the stitching line. Now, if you have not done this, because I'm going to have to mark this on my pattern piece. So grab pattern piece number 2. And what you want to do is where you have that dot, match it up and create your stitching line. So what I'm going to do is from this dot, I'm just going to make a stitching line. So I'm going to grab my ruler and I'm going to create a stitching line between the dot on the left and the dot in the center. So I'm creating a stitching line right there. And then on the other side, you're going to do the same thing. Just make sure that that dot matches up, which is this dot right here. You're going to go from this dot all the way down to the center as well. So I'm just going to make a line from here to there. Now, if you're not good with the ruler situation, you can put your pattern piece there and make sure that it matches up. So what you're going to do once again is I'm going to create one more line in the center for my center front seams, okay? My center front. All right, so that's what it should look like. It should resemble somewhat of a dart. And what you're going to do is you're going to base the center front right on that, right here on that line. Then you're going to stitch using a regular length stitch. You're going to sew along that stitching line to your dot here, pivot, lift your presser foot up, and then sew in the opposite direction. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that you have your front facing attached to your front, what we're going to do is go ahead and slash the center front. So I'm going to turn my top this direction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut through the center, just like this. But being sure to not pass that dot, okay? Now, if you have some dull scissors, because mine look a little dull, you can go ahead and use your rotary cutter as well, like I'm going to do. I'm going to use my rotary cutter for fabric to get over that, but I'm not going past that dot. So I'm going to go all the way to the dot, but do not go past the dot, okay? So what you have now is you have that opening that creates that V in the front, okay? Now, once you do that, you can go ahead and trim some of your seam allowance down right here. I'm just gonna trim like about 1/4 of an inch off right here. So you can do that too, if you would like. and then you're going to understitch. All right, so I'm just taking off a little bit on both sides, not much. Now you want to be careful so you do not accidentally cut through your stitching line at the bottom, okay? So that's enough for me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this portion right here, I'm going to unpick and take it off because I no longer need that portion, okay? So I'm just going to go ahead and take that portion off. If yours did the same thing when you attach your loop, you can go ahead and cut that portion off because you're not going to need it over there. Now that I have went ahead and clipped into the center portion of my center front, what you're going to do is go ahead and understitch. So when you do that, what you want to do is make sure all of your seam allowance is facing the facing, and then you're going to understitch that portion. So let me show you how you do that now. All right, so I'm going to make a quick correction about the loops. I told you guys to do it on the wrong side, but the loops are supposed to be attached on the right side of your fabric. So if you have not already cut into your loops, go ahead and make that change now, like I am going to do. So I'm going to make that change and come back and we'll continue. All right, so now that I went ahead and corrected the loops section before I went any further with this top, I know that in the previous clip, I told you to sew the loops onto the wrong side, but you need to sew the loops with the right sides together, pin it, and do all of that jazz or whatever. So this is what we are looking at right now. All right, so we went ahead and stitched the center front. We basted that. And then we went ahead and using a regular length stitch, we sewn from the right side all the way to the center and then pivot up and went to the left side and then slashed the center front. That's where we're at. And then I went ahead and trimmed the seam allowance down a little bit. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to press the seam allowance up towards the facing and do understitching. Now you're going to understitch on the front facing section. So make sure you are using about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and go ahead and understitch. You're going to understitch down one side all the way to the dot and then up the other section as well. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that I went ahead and understitched the facing portion together, so the next thing you want to do is go ahead and turn your facing to the inside, which is the wrong side. So you're going to turn your facing to the inside. It should be taking shape already anyway. Now, remind you, this portion should be pressed under like this. If you do not have it pressed under, go ahead to your ironing station and give that a good press. So your inside, this is the wrong side of my fabric facing up. So the inside should look like this right about now. Now I'm going to press mine again because I want my loops to be pressed out to where you could see them on the right side. So I'm going to give everything a good press now, and then I'm going to base just across the top. And I'm going to base across the top using about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that I went ahead and pressed my facing piece out, I based across the top. Now what you can do, you do not have to do this. You could just go ahead into top stitching on the right side. But what you can do is go ahead and baste down across and back up. Now I'm not going to baste that. What I'm going to do is take some pins and I'm going to pin on the right side. And I could see I know exactly where my facing is. I could see it because this is the light fabric. I'm just going to pin so I know where I will be top stitching, okay? So I'm just going to top stitch on the right side instead of do the basting stitch like the instruction says. I'm not doing all that jazz because you would have to pull out your stitching. So I'm just going to pin on the right side. I'm going to top stitch my entire facing. I'm going to go down one side. When I get towards the end, I'm going to pivot across and then up the other side. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that I went ahead and completely top stitched the facing onto my top, and it's good and all that good stuff. Now go ahead and grab pattern piece number 4, which is your back. And what you're going to do is, with right sides together, you're going to stitch the front to the back at shoulder seam. So I'm going to lay my back pattern piece down with right sides up. So this is my back pattern piece. So this is the right side up facing me. And I'm going to lay my front right on top with right side facing, just like this. I'm going to pin at my shoulder seams. So make sure you match up the notch and pin all the way across both shoulder seams. So go ahead and do that now. All right, so now that the shoulder seams are pinned using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and sew across both shoulder seams, and then finish off your shoulder seams. You could finish it off with your serger, pinking shears. You could even use bias tape if you made some. However you would choose to finish it off, that's completely up to you. I'm just gonna use my serger. So using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then finish off your seam allowance. Go ahead and do that now.